Great to be back with you and have a little bit more time this morning to do a more extensive reflection on the theme of discipleship. You will remember, those of you who were here yesterday, that what we were doing was just kind of setting out our territory, exploring what it meant to be a disciple in the first century, in first century Judaism, and the ways in which Jesus' disciples picked up from an expected norm, picked up and were kind of alongside what you would expect a first century Jewish disciple to be like. And then also we reflected on the way in which Jesus' disciples completely broke the mold. It's a bad start for the morning. Completely broke the mold of discipleship. So you've got this kind of double both and element going on around the theme of discipleship in the Gospels, the ways in which they were the same as other disciples, the ways in which they were completely different than other disciples. When I was thinking about what to do this morning, I thought that one of the fun things to do would be actually to have a focused look at one of the Gospels, Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel is often called by New Testament scholars the Gospel of Discipleship. More or less accurately, the trouble of calling it the Gospel of Discipleship is it rather implies the others aren't the Gospels of Discipleship, which I might want to dispute. I might want to agree that Mark is particularly about discipleship. It doesn't mean the others are not particularly about discipleship. So what I want to do this morning is explore a central bit of Mark, and we're going to be looking together at three key passages, one from Mark 4, one from Mark 6, and one from Mark 8. So if you've got Bibles with you, you might like to have them at the ready, because as well as my input this morning, you're going to be doing various bits of work around the table. So consequently, you might need to have your Bibles, but fear not. If you do not have a Bible to hand, the passage will be up on the screen, but what I particularly like you to do is read your Bible in the version that you like. The version that will be up in the screen is the NRSV, for the very simple reason that that's the version I like. It's not that I don't like the others, it's just the one I'm used to. But if you have a version that you're more familiar with, whichever it is, you might like to have it, especially if it's not the NRSV, because then you can compare and contrast with what's going on. So we're going to have kind of three major sections this morning, but they will kind of dribble over the coffee break. You will have a coffee break, never fear, the most important moment in the morning of a Diocesan conference. But what we'll do is we'll just stop when it gets to coffee and then we'll start again after coffee. So if you think that we're halfway through a session when we get to the coffee break, that will be fine. We'll work our ways around it and then we'll pick it up again after coffee. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by giving you a run-in into why we're looking at those three particular passages. And then once I've given you a run-in, we'll have a look at the three passages. And what we're going to be looking at this morning is what I've got there on the title screen, the character of discipleship. Because one of the really interesting things that we've done so far is we've looked at what disciples did and how they related. So it was action and relationship that we've looked at so far. But what we can discern from Mark's Gospel is Jesus appeared to have expectations of the character of the disciples who followed him. And what I want to do this morning is reflect a little bit about character and discipleship from these three passages and see what that might contribute to our reflections about how we encourage discipleship in our own context. So that's where we're going and what we're going to be looking at. So, as yesterday, let's start with a few preliminary issues. The first thing, which you are probably aware of but worth reminding yourself of, is that Mark's Gospel falls into four rough sections. They are rough. It would be really convenient of him if he had done exactly Mark 1 to 4, Mark 5 to 8, Mark 9 to whatever the other number would be, 12, and then, no, that's not right. My maths is appalling. Anyway, if he'd done it exactly according to a 4-chapter break, but he didn't. Probably because he wasn't writing in chapters with us in mind. But he does have kind of four major sections to his gospel. And one of the interesting things to notice is that the first section and the final section focus on Jesus. And the second section and the third section focus on the disciples. So you've got this kind of pyramid structure, which is quite interesting. So you've got Jesus and then the disciples, you've got the disciples and then Jesus. And there's a deliberate patterning going on, I think, in Mark's gospel, because what Mark is trying to do in introducing his gospel to you is introducing who Jesus was, how the disciples related to Jesus, how Jesus hoped the disciples would relate to him, and then what that meant in the terms of Jesus' life, the implication being, and therefore you will follow this pattern yourself in your life. So Mark is kind of putting these together. The first section of Mark's gospel is a really intriguing one. 1 verse 2 to 4:34, in case you're wondering what's wrong with 1 verse 1. 1 verse 1 is the title. It's the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. So he's saying, I'm just introducing to you what we're going into. And then therefore, the first section begins properly at 1 verse 2. And what's fascinating about that first section of Mark's Gospel is you've got a sample one of everything that you need to understand who Jesus is. So you've got a sample teaching, a sample healing, a sample exorcism, a sample parable. You have one of everything. You don't have more than one, you just have one of everything. So actually, if you wanted to do this is who Jesus is, you could very effectively read chapters 1 to 4:34 and get a little overview of exactly who Jesus was. Of course, we need to know a lot more about Jesus than just that, but it's almost as though Mark is kind of laying out the stall. Let me introduce you to this person, Jesus. As you get to know him more, you will see him doing more of this, more of that, more of the other, but this is who you can expect. This is who you can be looking for in Jesus. And then we have the second section, which is a section focused, let me just stop for one moment and say something I meant to say right at the start, which is, at the end of the session, I'm going to pass on my PowerPoint slides to whoever I'm going to pass them on to, which we will decide in a bit, and then they will be available on the website if that's helpful for anybody. I will now continue. The second section, the nature of discipleship, is a very, very interesting one, because in it you discover an extended conversation between Jesus and the disciples, which is punctuated by a whole load of other things. But the structure of the narrative, and this is what we're looking at this morning, is the structure of the narrative, are that you've got three key encounters between Jesus and the disciples. And the really intriguing thing about it is that each one of the encounters is in a boat. Mark 4, Mark 6, Mark 8. And one of the things I absolutely love about the Gospels is the recognition that the Gospels were, of course, designed to be heard and not to be read. And therefore, what the Gospel writers did in order to keep you with the plot, and let me just be very clear, I'm not saying that therefore they made anything up. I don't think they did make anything up. But what they were doing is keeping you with the structure of their narrative. In order to keep you with the plot, they would drop in really significant moments, really significant devices, so that you knew something important was going on. So, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, if you encounter a mountain, you know something significant is about to happen. There are 6 key mountains in Matthew's Gospel, where all the key action, again, if you wanted to kind of pull out just the 6 mountain experiences in Matthew's Gospel, you would get a really good sample of what's going on in the interaction between Jesus and the disciples. The last one of all being the Great Commission. So, in Matthew, it's mountains. In Luke, it's journeys, and in Mark, it's boats. You know something significant is about to happen when they get into a boat. It's almost as though you're meant to go, oh, hello, they're getting into a boat. Something is about to happen. So the structure of the boat narratives cover 4, 6, and 8. And then in between those, you have a whole range of encounters between Jesus and other people and various bits of Jesus' teaching, which tell you something about what Mark is trying to teach us about the character of discipleship. The third section, the way of the cross, is an interesting one, and if we had an extra couple of days, we'd have gone on to the third section, because the third section is where Jesus begins his extensive teaching about the shadow of the cross that falls over his life and over the lives of those who are going to follow him. So the 8 to 10:52 is the section of Mark's Gospel which is about the cost of discipleship, which we looked at briefly yesterday. But if we had longer, we we would have a look at it in greater depth. Because I think one of the really important things that Mark is communicating in very, very clear terms is that Jesus has expectation of character of his disciples. He also has expectation of the cost that disciples are prepared to engage with in order to be his followers. So there's something actually really important about that third section. And then, of course, you get to the final section, which is Jesus' own journey to the cross, which ends, in my view, in 16 verse 8, with that rather anticlimactic ending where the women run away because they're afraid. But what is very striking about that, which I think kind of brings you to the end of the whole discipleship narrative, is one of the things you might have noticed all the way through Mark's gospel, is the number of times Jesus says, don't tell anybody. It's the weirdest thing about Mark's gospel, is that just about something really important happens, somebody gets really excited, and Jesus says, don't say anything. And one of the things that has for years intrigued New Testament scholars is why it is that Jesus tells people not to say anything. My own view is that you discover this in Mark 16. Because in Mark 16, come the resurrection, you get the only time in Mark's gospel where anybody says, go tell. The women meet the angels at the tomb, and the angel says, go tell the disciples and other people in Galilee. And it seems to me that the reason why you shouldn't tell earlier in Mark's gospel is because you might get the wrong end of the stick, as Mark beautifully illustrates Peter doing at Caesarea Philippi. You get that moment, that kind of real high moment, which is just at the start of the third section, where, the disciples have been walking around going, no, we don't understand, no, we still don't understand, no, we still don't understand. And then eventually, Peter goes, you are the Christ, and we, the readers, are meant to go, yay, he's got it. And then he says, and you're not to die. Kind of half a cheer for Peter, in that he's got who Jesus is, but he hasn't understood who Jesus is. He's got half of him and not the other half. And it seems to me that if they went and told who Jesus was too early, then actually the whole thing would unravel. So you get to the end in 16 verse 8 where you have all the jigsaw pieces, and then the angel says, go tell. At which point, those of you who are awake and here yesterday will be going, didn't she just say yesterday that actually they were sent out to proclaim? Notice what they were sent out to proclaim earlier, because it's very, very interesting. Earlier in Mark's gospel, they are sent to proclaim the kingdom. By the time you get to verse 16, they are then allowed to proclaim the nature of Jesus. So it's almost as though by the time you get to the end of Mark 16, you get to proclaim the whole lot. But earlier is just the proclamation of the coming of the kingdom. That's what they're sent to do in Mark 6. That's what the disciple is told to proclaim in Luke 9. And the interesting question is, what is the difference between proclaiming the kingdom and proclaiming the nature of Jesus? I shall leave that to you to reflect on as we go through the morning. So, let us move on now to having a look at our particular passages. And you need to be aware that Mark really sets you up to understand what's going on in a really very significant way. This is how the first section of Mark ends. Verse 33 to 34. So we've just had the parable of the sower, which you may remember, with that very, very confusing bit in the middle that he speaks in parables so that the outsiders won't understand. And it ends with many such parables he spoke to the word to them as they were able to hear it, but he did not speak to them except in parables. So Jesus, Mark tells us, spoke to the world in parables. But it's okay. You can all relax, because he explained everything in private to his disciples. So we can all relax and know all is well. The disciples, who are the learners from Jesus, are not just told parables. Jesus explains everything to them. So they understand it all, don't they? And then we start the next section. And it's very important to keep that in your mind, because what's going on is Mark is preparing you for what you're about to encounter. And immediately we find our next story. So immediately after 4:34, we have the stilling of the storm. These are our 3 boat stories that you encounter in Mark's Gospel. 4:35 to 41 is the stilling of the storm. 6:45 to 52 is the walking on the water. And then 8:14 to 21 is the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, we haven't got the time to do all of this whole section, obviously, this morning. So we're going to be focusing on those 3. But I would just like to draw your attention now, and then I'll draw your attention again back at the end of the whole of this session, on various things that happen between these narratives. There's lots of things that happen between these narratives, but there are 5 really key things that happen between these narratives. After the stilling of the storm, Jesus has an encounter with the Gerasene demoniac, with Jairus, and with a woman with a hemorrhage. Then, after the walking on the water, he encounters the Syrophoenician woman and the man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. Then, after the leaven of the Pharisees, he has an encounter with the man born blind. And it's really very, very important to hold in your mind that actually this is going on between these big encounters, because it's really important. And we will return to the importance of it later. But let me trail one thing for you, and then we will turn back and have a look at it in more detail when we get to the end, which is that one of the things that happens in Mark's Gospel, which is a really important thing to recognise, is that there are 3 big groups that encounter Jesus and always relate to Jesus in the same kind of way in Mark's Gospel. You have the Jewish authorities, the scribes and the Pharisees, who always relate to Jesus in a negative way. If you go all the way through Mark's Gospel, you can see they always, when they come together as a group, they are always negative towards Jesus. Then you have the crowd, and the crowd are really important in Mark's Gospel because they're always amazed. They are kind of intriguing, are the crowd. The crowd follow Jesus around going, wow, we've never seen anything like this before. They're kind of a lovely little group, really, are the crowd. They kind of follow Jesus around with their jaws hanging open the whole time. And then you have the disciples. And the disciples, we'll encounter how the disciples engage with Jesus. But what I think Mark is doing a really intriguing thing. He's introducing you to how groups behave, and he's introducing you to how individuals behave. And what's going on here is you've got 3 key group encounters interspersed with 5 key individual encounters. So just keep your eye on that, because I think it's quite an interesting one. And you can decide whether you think it is significant or not that there's a 3-2-1 structure going on there. One of the things that happens when you are sad like me and start studying the text really carefully is patterns start popping out all over the place, because we kind of like patterns. We like chiasms, which is where things cross over, and we like structures, and we like numbers. Do you think Mark intended it or not? Who knows? But we just like to notice it. So I'll leave you to decide whether you think it's significant or not that there's a 3-2-1 structure going on there. We've got about 10 minutes now to have a bit of a conversation on this. There'll be more times for conversation as we go through the morning. So has anyone got questions, observations, disagreements, reflections, thoughts about timidity? Sorry, I've got Simon.
Hey. Thank you. We reflected the link between your fear factor and what Bishop Stephen said about chronic low self-image in South Yorkshire. Yeah. And also every fishing community has fear because they have memories of loved ones who have died. And so they had some reasons for their fear.
That's right.
And if you're in a culture where for several generations you do not experience success, it breeds a culture. And so there's a question of how one takes that culture seriously and helps it without being so inspirational you're far above anywhere beyond what they think is achievable.
I profoundly helpful comment, really, because I went to school in Moss Side in Manchester, so I have another element of the low self-esteem that comes from growing up in a UPA. And I think one of the things that I find very frustrating is when I admit my lack of self-esteem, which I still have, people say, well, you've got no grounds for it. Well, you just telling me that doesn't help, does it? Just telling me that I shouldn't have low self-esteem is not the solution. That's why it is a very intriguing one that Jesus begins to combat with the disciples. And it is actually the first very in-depth conversation we discover between Jesus and his disciples. So clearly it's something that he, A, thinks is very important, and B, thinks that they should address in terms of their discipleship. And therefore I think it is something for us to think very deeply and profoundly about. I wish I knew the solution, quite frankly, to addressing those questions of being Delos and having low self-esteem, because if I knew the solution, I could then start doing something about myself as well as everybody else. And so there is... So I want to start by saying I absolutely resonate with the problem, and simply declaring you shouldn't have it is not the solution. Equally, as you say, coming in and just being fabulous and marvellous is also not the solution, because then people will just say, well, look, that's you being fabulous and marvellous, doesn't solve the problem. But I think there is something that Jesus was trying to tell the disciples by linking the two halves of his sentence. Why are you Delos? Have you no faith? And there is something about faith which suggests, therefore, that will combat this chronic problem of being Delos. And I haven't got an easy solution. It's one of those that I think needs to be worked on and pressed more rather than just kind of given an easy solution. But let me start by saying I think there is something about faith being in one who is able, one who is absolutely powerful, one who can transform. And it was a little bit about what I was talking about yesterday about the cost of discipleship. Denying yourself involves putting Jesus at the centre rather than yourself at the centre. And there is, I think, something that goes on there, which is a very powerful dynamic about making faith the centre, the faith in Jesus the centre, which therefore makes the low self-esteem less crippling. Which is certainly true in my experience, but it doesn't mean it goes away. And I think one of the interesting questions is actually how you then go on further than that and work. But it seems that it's a vitally important question for us to press on. So thank you.
I think you've already said much of what we were going to say, but just to throw into the mix, from Paul, God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power and love and self-control.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And somebody said to me in conversation after the session, which I very much liked and did want to make sure I dropped in, so you've given me the opportunity to do so, is that, of course, the role of the Spirit in the post-Pentecost church is vital in discipleship, because the role of the Spirit is that which is as Jesus to us now. We have our relationship with Jesus, but the Spirit is that which gives us the power. And there is something in that, again, to be pressed and explored. So thank you.
In my own experience, getting rid of timidity was a priest who enabled me to exercise my ministry in my fear. But I think it's our identity in Christ and knowing ourselves to be beloved and that we're the apple of God's eye. I tell people that and they just cannot comprehend they have a God who loves them so much. And it's helping them to understand that, yes, they put Christ at the centre, but they are in the centre of God in his love and in his holding. Because apart from our chronic low self-esteem, because of the communities we've grown up in, there's also all that's been piled on us individually. Those layers of pain and beliefs about self. So I think it's a slow process, but loving beyond measure, seeing the good, living with the very difficult, challenging what needs challenging, but bringing people out of themselves to recognise who they are in Christ, and then there's a freedom in that, because you think, actually, it's not me now, it's the Spirit. So enabling. I was saying, I was at a church in Bradford. I turned up one week. The week after, I was doing a talk, quaking from head to foot, and you could. But my vicar stood next to me and let me do it. So doing that, allowing people to have a go. Have a go.
Thank you. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. having a go, the encouragement to try it despite the fear, and the theme of love, I think, very, very powerful. Because, of course, love casts out fear. So, therefore, that kind of the interchange between love and fear is a very important one. And it's also worth reminding ourselves, of course, that we are talking about discipleship and how not to do it, in that the disciples apparently didn't ever stop being Delos, because when it came to the big moment in Gethsemane, they pegged it. So, actually, we're not talking about a magic solution, now I'm Delos, not Delos. And an interesting question would be, if you asked Peter post-Pentecost, did he lose it? I suspect the answer is it's a lifelong journey. So we're talking about long journeys. So thank you. Where am I?
Paula, thank you for the subtlety that you've just put into this, because I think in some ways you've already said what I was trying to articulate in the group here, which is that what would the opposite of timidity be? That was one of our questions. How do you recognise where faith is part? So I think I was trying to sort of articulate that I've always been a timid person, and I don't think I don't think that's always a lack of faith, but it's where my timidity becomes the limit to what I will do, how I will act. When my timidity sets the tone, then I need this story. Then I need to be reminded that I have to feel the fear and do it anyway, as that marvellous American book said. So somehow faith is an infection. It's a sort of, it needs to be within the timidity rather than the counter, in my experience, rather than the countering it. It's the two kind of belong together, because my greater fear is of certainty and of, that kind of fundamentalist truth, which just, actually, I'd love those people to have a little bit more timidity. So that subtlety I thank you for.
Yeah. No, and I think timidity is for a good reason. When my younger daughter was about 3, I would have loved her to have a bit more timidity, because she scared me to death. She would see a tree and be up at the top of it without any moment. Timidity is sometimes a really good thing as well. But in a sense, what we're trying to do here is kind of unpick those relationships, aren't we? And say, well, what is it about? Where does it come from? What does it stop us doing? What does it contribute to? And I think there's something important in that. So thank you. Someone wave at me. Yep. Where am I then?
Hi, right at the back. We were thinking a bit about the fact that you need to know the person as to how far they're willing to go, and some people you seem to be able to push them forward, and others it's harder for them. So we then got round to talking about what about the issue of not doing stuff on your own? What about discipleship in the plural sense?
Yes.
Because, the sort of fishers of people image isn't the lonely person with a rod, it's a team in a boat, and we're thinking about boats here. Yeah. So wondering how is that going to come out of these studies, looking at how they conquered this element of timidity through working together, through apprenticing and working with somebody who's maybe a little bit further on, that sort of thing, because we found that quite helpful. I
would just like to say it just has come out of these studies, so thank you. I entirely agree that one of the kind of key elements is that you're not a disciple on your own. In our overwhelmingly individual culture, we think about, and just a little rule of thumb, which I'm sure it's always worth reminding yourself of, is that the problem with our English language is when we read the word you, we read it singularly. And whereas in the New Testament, the vast majority of times it's plural rather than singular. So you should always default to thinking more than one rather than one when engaging with New Testament texts. And this is exactly what's going on here, is that Jesus is not saying, why are you an individual timid, but why are you together as a group timid? And actually what changes when you as a group stop being timid? And that's a very interesting dynamic for which I thank you enormously, because actually it may be that each one of them remained Delos, but actually together, post-Pentecost, they stopped being Delos, and that is a vastly important dynamic. And keep in mind on the time, I'm going to take one more because I know that it's lined up, and then we're going to move on to the next passage.
I feel partly like, and I'm enjoying it, but I do feel partly like we're unpicking a moment from Peter Kay's Car Share or something, because it's about comedy as well.
Yes,
For me. But I think the comedy resonates for me as well with the book of Jonah, where you've got fear and terror, terrible danger, but massive questions, and comedy shot through those moments, as it does happen with Jonah. But it seems that there's irony and comedy, and we were commenting on how we don't know with what tone of voice Jesus said this to them.
Absolutely, yes.
And how dark was the comedy of the situation when people are, as referenced earlier, the frightening work, the fishing, how very dark was the comedy, or how much levity was there in there?
Absolutely. I'm with you all the way, and this is a highly comic moment, and the third boat scene is an even more comic moment. And there is something quite interesting about kind of the weaving in of the comedy, which is, one of the frustrations I often hear people say is that the problem with the New Testament is just not funny. And I want to say, well, which one are you reading? Because mine's hysterical. And there is something about the tone of voice, isn't there? And fascinatingly, there are some commentaries on this passage that say Jesus told the disciples off. And I would say, well, I see nothing in the passage of Jesus telling the disciples off, because you have just interpreted a tone of voice in, the "why are you afraid" kind of tone of voice. Whereas, as you say, it could be much lighter. Which will be a very interesting thing to play with and explore. So thank you. I always like when somebody introduces comedy into the conversation. We need to move on now to our next passage. And my intention is that what we're going to do is we'll kind of set up the passage. We're going to stop at 10:02 because there's a very important announcement from EIG, or a conversation with EIG. And then we'll pick it up again after coffee. So let us move to our second one, walking on the water, chapter 6, verses 45 to 52. So let's begin by reading the passage. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over to the other side, though he doesn't actually say it here, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. So an absolutely fascinating passage on the heels of Mark 4. And various things to notice from this passage is that one of the curses I think we struggle with in reading the New Testament is we read it in 5 and 6 verse chunks. And the problem with reading it in 5 and 6 verse chunks is that you forget what's just happened. So much so, in fact, and particularly the way in which the lectionary works, by the time you get to the walking on the water story in the lectionary, you have a vague, if you're lucky, you have a vague memory that we've had a stilling of the storm, but you can't quite remember, was it the same passage or is it slightly different? And it's very easy to kind of overlap them two in your mind, and forget that actually in Mark, this is just 2 chapters ago. So if you were Mark's audience hearing it, that would be approximately 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago. It's not all that long since they've heard it. So therefore Mark's original audience will be going, oh, we just had one just like this. So they are alert to the similarities and differences. So let's just have a look at the similarities and differences. There are some strong similarities between this story and the other story. It happens at night, or late in the evening. there is the presence of a storm or a strong wind, but the really important thing to notice about this storm or strong wind is there's no implication that it's going to capsize the boat. It's just making it hard to row. So it's not, there's no danger involved here, it's simply that it is a strong wind. And you could say, well, they're on the Sea of Galilee. There's often a strong wind. If any of you've been on the Sea of Galilee, you're lucky if you get out to the middle of the Sea of Galilee without a strong wind. You have fear, and now you are alert to the fear motif. You might have noticed the fear that comes through this. And then you have, strikingly, a calming of the storm. But what's interesting is that the calming of the storm in this instance isn't the point. So it's passed over in the way that it was the point in the previous one. The dissimilarities is Jesus is not now snoozing nicely in the stern of the boat. He isn't in the boat at all. Here we have Jesus walking on the water and the significance of Jesus walking on the water. And you have the response to Jesus, which is a very interesting response. There is fear around in this story, but actually the more important response when we get to the end of this story is that they are bemused, they're astonished, and we'll kind of explore that word a little bit more. So you have a different response to Jesus in this, which is interesting and worth noting. So, the one thing that everybody is intrigued by in this passage, and I too am intrigued by it, that little bit, let's just go back to it so we see it, which says, he came walking towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. Why? Why did he intend them to pass them by? Let me start by saying we have no idea. So we need to start with we've no real idea why Jesus intended to pass them by, but let's have a go at reflecting on it. Because it seems such an important little throwaway line that Mark must have meant us to make something of it. So let's try and make something of it and see what we can come out of by reflecting on the passing them by. I mean, one possibility is that actually Jesus regularly walked on the water. And therefore, he was just doing what Jesus did, tootling away on the Sea of Galilee. And he was wondering whether they might notice him this time or not, you know. So. But that seems not to be the point. That seems really not to be the point of what Mark is saying, though an intriguing notion nevertheless. Two verses are often cited as possible help for us to work out why it is that he passed them by. One of them comes from the book of Job, which I think is quite interesting. Job 9, verse 11, talking about God. Look, he passes me by and I do not see him. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. And in the light of what happens later on in the passage, there seems to be possibly something that resonates with this passage here, because it's about the seeing and understanding and perceiving of what is going on here. The idea that actually God is forever passing us by. It's not that he isn't there, it's just that we don't notice him. And there may be some kind of element there that actually what Jesus is doing in this is waiting for the response from the disciples, and that there is something about the response which seems important. This seems to me to be added to by the other example of Jesus intending something. And it's Luke 24, which you will all know very well. It's the story of the road to Emmaus. And that odd little detail, again an odd little detail, right at the end of the story where, they've gone all the way to Emmaus. And as they came near to the village to which they were walking, he walked ahead as if he were going on. And it's almost as though you've got a kind of a resonance here as well, with this passage, that Jesus is waiting for some kind of response. If you remember what happens in Luke 24, and for me it's a really vital moment, that Jesus appears to be walking on, and then the disciples say, no, stop, and they give him hospitality. And for me, what is really important in the dynamic of Luke 24 is that when Jesus first meets the disciples on their way out of Jerusalem, they are completely self-absorbed. they are despondent, they are downhearted, and they can barely notice who this person is. And we're told that they just don't recognise who Jesus is. And then at the end of Luke 24, they do recognise who he is. And one of the things that changes, there's many things that change in the passage, but one of the things that changes is that they reach out to Jesus and say, come in and have a meal with us. And there's something there in Jesus saying, well, how are you going to respond to me now? And they then respond and invite him in. Does this help? Let us look back at the passage. I'm not entirely sure whether it helps or not, but it is nevertheless interesting just to stop and reflect on them. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. If Jesus was looking for a response, I'm not sure that's the response he was looking for. So the way in which actually those two verses don't help is that actually if it is about response, the response wasn't a great one. But could that be the point? It might be that that's the point, and actually what we're doing here is engaging again with the response that Jesus wants from the disciples and the response that he gets from the disciples. And actually he might have wanted the response of them encountering him, engaging with him, and inviting him into the boat or something. So it might be that he was waiting for a response and they gave the wrong response. They saw him and they were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said something very important indeed. Literally what Jesus said is, have courage. I am. Do not be afraid. And for those of you who are doing that thing that you possibly didn't expect to be doing at this time on a morning, is saying, now I wonder what Greek word is used there for fear. It's the phobos word, interestingly. So he's not saying here, don't be delos, but what he is saying is, do not be gripped by fear. So we're into that kind of fear dynamic again. And if you remember from the last time, Jesus has this dynamic between timidity and faith. And Jesus is here saying, it's really me. I am. And the interesting question that we're challenged with is how much we want to read in to Jesus saying, I am at the moment. Just to kind of get you up to speed with it. You may remember in John's Gospel the really important feature of the I am sayings. And one of the big discussions is the significance of Jesus saying I am. When we encounter it in John's Gospel, we know that something important is happening because Jesus doesn't just say I am, which would be the verb to be. He says always I am. So here in Mark, he says what he says in John. I am. So the interesting question is whether we're just to read this as, it's okay, it's me, or actually whether Jesus is saying something very much more profound, which were it in John's Gospel, we'd be making a vast amount about. But because it's in Mark's Gospel, we don't make the same amount about it. Should we? It's a genuine question. I shall leave it up to you to decide. But there is something I think really very important about Jesus' conversation here. They see Jesus. They are absolutely terrified. And Jesus says, I am, and has that invitation of response, invitation of their engagement with him. Then he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. And just notice at this point, that's just a little byproduct of the story. You know, before, it was the whole point of the story. Now it just is just a kind of a byproduct. But verse 51 is really very, very important indeed, 51 to 52. They were utterly astounded. Now, if you were listening carefully earlier, you may remember that there are people in Mark's Gospel who are always astounded, and it's the crowd. And what's very interesting is in this instance, Mark now uses the same word that the crowd are always of the disciples. And it does raise the question about whether Mark is saying, just because the crowd never learn, never learn, all the way through Mark's Gospel, they're just amazed all the time. Are the disciples being plunged into the category of people who are not learning, raising the question of whether they're really being disciples, because they're just, they are now astounded about the encounter with Jesus? But the really important word comes after this, in verse 52. They did not understand. That understanding word seems to me to be a really, really important one, because what Mark is talking about here is saying that the disciples really ought to have been able to put pieces together and come to a conclusion. Because you could say, well, how were they meant to know that Jesus was the kind of person who would be able to walk on water so that they wouldn't be terrified when they saw Jesus walking on the water? Mark gives us the answer. They ought to have known that because of the loaves. And just to kind of speed you up with where we are in Mark's Gospel, they've just had the feeding of the 5,000. So what Mark is saying is that the disciples should have seen something about the loaves and the fishes and the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, and from the feeding of the 5,000, drawn a conclusion about who Jesus was, therefore understood more about who Jesus was, so that when Jesus came walking on the water, they would understand who he was. So what he's talking about there is discipleship as lateral thinking. Your ability to see God here and then say, so now I expect to see God in this way here. You might say that's a big ask, but it's an interesting ask. And that seems to me what's going on in this particular passage. I'm going to stop. It's got to 10 to 11. What I'll do after the coffee break is pick us up and remind you about where we are. And I want to end with focusing, before I send you off to do your conversation as you did before, about this question about understanding. The Greek word is suniemi. And it's kind of connected with being together. The word sun is together word. And that word suniemi, as I was kind of indicating just before the coffee break, seems to me to be a really intriguing one about understanding the nature of discipleship and what we're called to be as Christians. It seems that actually what Mark is commenting, is this isn't a comment of Jesus at this point, this is Mark's commentary on what happened for the disciples, was that the expectation of the disciples was that they should see Jesus do this. And in this instance, it was the feeding of the 5,000. And from what they saw in the feeding of the 5,000, they should have been able to answer some of that question, the who is this question that they asked in chapter 4. And having answered that question of who is this, when the next encounter happened, which was now in the boat with the walking on the water, they should have learnt from this event and be able to read into this event what they'd learnt from that event. That word suniemi is about, as I said, putting pieces together. It's your ability to do lateral thinking, to see this here and then understand what it means here. And it seems to me that there is actually something really important about that in understanding our relationship with Jesus and our kind of our ability to respond in terms of disciples. One of the really interesting questions is, how good are we today at doing that kind of thing? Saying, this is what we know of God. This is who we know Jesus to be. This is what we know happens when the Spirit is present. Now, having learnt those lessons, can I apply them into this context in which I am? Can I now understand more of who God is? Can I notice where God is? And one of the themes that I think comes strongly through the biblical narrative is being people who are able to be God noticers, who are able to say, I know who God is and I see God coming here. One of the things I'm sure you know already is God always comes in unexpected form. You can be pretty confident that if you are looking this way for God to come doing what God did last time, God is over here doing something completely different. And my experience of people who are saying, I don't see God at work, is because they're looking in the wrong direction for the wrong thing. And it seems that there is something really very important about the character of disciple who is able to learn the type of God, be able to recognize the nature of God. The person I think gets this perfectly, is the perfect example of this in the New Testament, is Simeon in the temple. If you remember Simeon in the temple, he's driven into the temple by the Holy Spirit. And he has been, like Anna, has been waiting for years and years for the redemption of Israel. Now, any first century Jew would tell you that the redemption of Israel looks like the Romans being driven out, Israel being declared to be the nation that they always believed themselves to be, God being in the midst of them. They're going to have wealth and prosperity and peace and justice, and it's going to be all those prophecies of Isaiah, which you probably know, all rolled into one in one glorious, happy wonderfulness of redemption. So Simeon knows that he's waiting for redemption. And Jesus comes into the temple in the form of a tiny baby. We're not entirely sure precisely how tiny, somewhere between 8 days and a month. He's a tiny baby. And Simeon sees the tiny baby Jesus, and in the words of the Nunc Dimittis says, "My eyes have seen salvation." He hasn't done anything yet. He's a tiny baby. All he's done is be a tiny baby. But Simeon was able to know what he was looking for and say, there it is. And part of the story of the Gospels is Jesus is there walking on the water, and the disciples are saying, who is this? So in contrast with Simeon, who was able to recognize the tiny baby, the disciples are struggling to do their understanding. So my question that arises out of this passage is that Jesus expected his disciples to be people who can understand and make sense of what they've seen of God, so that they recognize when they see it the next time, and the next time, and the next time, with the rule of thumb being that God always comes in a way that you don't expect God to come. So the ability to recognize becomes really important. So your task for your next I haven't got my question up there. I thought the question was up there. The question for reflection, therefore, is this one. Is what do we need to do to become better at people who can understand and make sense of the things of God that we have seen? What are the features that we need to put into our lives together so that we can become disciples who are better at comprehending, at understanding, about recognizing God? We have less time now than we did when I started talking, always. It's always the story of my life. So therefore, I'm going to get you to talk to each other for about 10 minutes this time, so till just after 10:02. But if you want to, again, I'll go back to the passage in a moment so you can see the passage, talk a little bit about the passage, and reflect together about this question, about becoming people who are good at understanding. Then again, we'll have 10 minutes for a conversation together before we get on to our final passage. So, same rule applies. Talk to people if you want to, don't talk to them if you don't want to, but reflect on the passage and on the question about understanding. One of my great passions, as some of you will know, is that it's really important for laity and clergy to talk together and to have our voices equally heard in contexts. As a layperson, I spend most of my life trying to achieve some of this. And it has been observed to me that the vast majority of people asking questions are clerical. Which is no criticism at all, because they're all lovely and fabulous questions. But I want to just take this opportunity to encourage those of you who are lay that it's really, really important for our conversation if you want to say something, to say something. So please don't feel you have to if it's a horrible and awful thought. But if you're itching to say something, I'm primed the microphone holders to look out for you especially and give you priority. So just know that they've got their beady eyes on you if you want to say something. So, we've now got about 10 minutes or so for further reflections on this question of understanding and what went on in the walking on the water passage. So has anyone got anything they want to say? Of course, this is going to squash everything, because now nobody who's clerical is going to feel they're able to ask any questions. And we'll all sit in deep silence for 10 minutes, but that's okay. Do feel free to contribute freely. I knew that would happen.
Thanks. Really helpful so far. Thank you so much. I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on the fact that Mark seems to attribute their not understanding to a hardness of heart.
Yes. Thank you. It is the reason why I didn't comment this time is it becomes really important in chapter 8, but let's talk about it now because it is a really important one. That theme of having hard hearts is a fascinating one that runs all the way through the Old Testament, all the way back to the Isaiah 6 calling, if you remember, that God hardens people's hearts. And one of the kind of uncomfortable references, according to hard hearts, is whether God deliberately makes people's hearts hard or whether we have naturally hard hearts. Interestingly, Mark doesn't make a comment here on where the hardness of the heart comes from. But let me just talk about hardness of heart, because I think it's quite an interesting phrase. You may know that in Hebrew thinking, you do your thinking in your heart. So it's your the centre of your decision making, where you do your thought processes. It gives you rational thinking. And what's fascinating in Hebrew thinking is that you think with your heart as well as feeling with your heart. What happens in later thinking when you go into more Greek philosophical, you think with your head, or your kind of that bit of your soul which is in your head, and you feel with your heart, and that has entirely influenced the way in which we think about thinking. So you will regularly hear people say, I need a moment for that to sink from my head to my heart, as though that's a natural thing. Hebrews would go, why? What would you be doing there? Because they think that you do your rational processes and your emotional processes in the same place in your body. And it is just worth contemplating for a moment what that does to thinking and how you think about thinking in the light of that. The hardness of heart, therefore, is that you've got an emotional and rational connection going on. So their hearts are emotionally hardened, and therefore they can't do their proper rational thinking, is effectively what is going on with that phrase, to have a hardness of heart. And so therefore there is something really quite interesting about drawing that connection, about comprehension and your ability to do your thinking emotionally and rationally together. And I think it is a really interesting and challenging question, is how do we make sure that we have soft hearts and not hard hearts, is a very interesting one in terms of our discipleship. So hearts that are open for new ideas, open for new experiences, open for new recognitions, that kind of thing. So thank you for drawing attention, because it's a really important question, I think.
I'm a layman, thank you.
Yay!
A very ordinary no one, but there's a passage which is constantly in my mind on this, about timidity and cowardice and things, and that's that wonderful passage at the end of Romans 8, that nothing can separate us. So if we live with that we're forever mindful of Jesus and there, then surely, we're in tune with God, and nothing can harm us, nothing can make us cowardly, timidly, or anything, and surely can help us to understand what it's about. Perhaps I'm not come across very well, but it's...
No, you come across beautifully, thank you. That's exactly, I think, what's going on really in the Mark and narrative, which is that recognition about if only they could recognise who God really was. And you've got this double theme kind of looping round here and in the next ones. If only they could recognise really who God really was and comprehend who God really was, then they wouldn't have need for Delos, because once they've comprehended who God really was, they would understand that nothing can separate us from the love of God, that love is all in all, and therefore they wouldn't have the need for the Delos, and round you go. So I think you kind of put in a bit of Paul that really helps us understand what's going on in this particular context. I had a conversation over coffee, which I'd like to kind of pop in at this point, because I think it's an important one, about the recognition, again, we noted it, but worth kind of coming back to it again, about the importance of the fact that we are called to be disciples together and not on our own, and that kind of importance of that dynamic of recognising the love of God together, and it's the love of God together that allows us into kind of that understanding that we don't need to be afraid, and we can make connections and understandings which are important. I think the microphone is on its... Oh, no.
Oh, sorry. This scripture says our hearts can be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin.
Yes.
Sprung to mind. When the disciples were with Jesus and they experienced the feeding of the 5,000, they saw Jesus do something which is beyond their possibilities, but they were caught up into living in God's possibilities because he did that through them. He said, you do it. Now, we're constantly in that place as disciples of learning that God wants us to live in his possibilities. He actually wants to use us. But the sin aspect where our hearts are hardened is when we refuse that and we sort of live in our possibilities and we set the limits of what God can do because we're looking at ourselves. And it strikes me always that actually constantly acknowledging that sin helps our hearts to be more open to living God's possibilities.
Thank you. Brilliantly put.
Just another thought about the hardness of heart. So, isn't the first instance of that really Pharaoh in Exodus, who is downright stupid in not getting the hint, really. So he's the one with the hardness of heart and doesn't recognise Moses for who he is. Moses leads the people through the wilderness and does the bit with the manna, and which they don't altogether understand. And then he leads them through the Red Sea, which kind of correspond with the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water. So I think there's something about Jesus being the new Moses, leading us to a new kind of kingdom.
Yes, absolutely. And that's certainly very clear in the way in which Matthew tells the story, much clearer than it is in the way that Mark tells the story. But I absolutely agree that there is the kind of part of the gospel narrative is, can we actually do this in a new way? Can we go round this roundabout again, but have a less hard heart so that we can understand what's going on? And I think there's kind of those seeds are being sown in this particular context. And therefore the challenge for us is, can we engage with what God is doing in a way that means that we don't have hard hearts? Thank you. We'll have one more and then we shall move on.
I wanted to ask you if you would say more about these reactions of the disciples being about responding to miracles, and talk a bit more to us.
Absolutely, yes.
Tell us a bit more about the response to miracles and the miraculous, what's going on in that aspect of being discipled.
Well, this is just my view, but my view is that John gives us the clue to understanding what's going on in miracles when he calls them signs, because the signs are what reveal to us who Jesus really is. And in a way, the way in which John very carefully chooses his 7 miracles is, if you put them all together, the 7 signs reveal to you the deep essence of the nature of Jesus. And when you look at them, you discover that actually the deep essence of Jesus is the deep essence of God. They are about the ability to have power over creation. They're about the ability to bring life where there's death. They're about the ability to see into the hearts of people and show love. And so I think that the essence of the miracles are about understanding that Jesus is deeply and profoundly God. And therefore, if the disciples could respond to Jesus as though he were God, then actually that would unlock all of this and their hearts would stop being hardened.
So when it comes to the discipleship process, what you're saying, it's about what's the process going on through responding to a miracle? Well, I would say that there's probably more to it than this. I'm too close to that speaker. There's probably more to it than this, but what I think is going on is the disciples' ability to recognise that Jesus is in fact divine. And therefore, who he is more, the answer to the question, who is this, is more than he is Jesus of Nazareth. It's more than he is this person that we know and encounter. It is their ability to get to that next big statement, which is, and he is God. Beyond Peter's, you are the Christ, to actually you are God himself. And that seems, I think, kind of the really key bit to what's going on. Which is a beautiful place to get us to our third story. Our third story is one you may be less familiar with. We've all know the story of the stilling of the storm, and we know the story of the walking on the water. Our third boat scene might have passed you by because it's a less obvious boat scene. Nothing quite so spectacular happens in it. It is nevertheless, I think, really very important for understanding our framework that we've been looking at this morning. So let's read it and then I'll explain a little bit more to you. In order to understand what's going on, incidentally, you now need to know that immediately before the walking on the water was the feeding of the 5,000. Immediately before this boat encounter was the feeding of the 4,000. So you've got the feeding coming back again, which explains something that the disciples say. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. So now you're alert to this, and you're going, ooh, interesting, important stuff about to happen. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And they said to one another, it's because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand?
Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? I'm tempted in a way not to say anything more really, because I think once we've got there, you see what's going on. But you've given me the time, so I shall continue and then we can talk about it a little bit more. It is such a beautiful set piece. Now you've seen chapter 4 and chapter 6, you suddenly see what's going on in chapter 8. Back to the comedy. The comedy is glorious here, don't you think? Remember that they've been on the top of a mountain, Mark 6, and didn't have any bread. And then they were on the top of a mountain just now, and they didn't have any bread. And then they get into a boat, and they haven't got quite enough bread. So there's kind of a lovely theme of them not really kind of putting anything together and making any connections. But you would also have thought that by now they would have realised that not having bread wasn't an issue. It's not a problem. They've got one loaf, there's 12 of them. That should have been fine. No need to worry yourself excessively about this. But what is fascinating about this whole dynamic is the disciples' fixation on a little bit of learning that they've done, which misses the enormous bit of learning that they could have done. So they're now totally focused on the bread. And of course, Jesus isn't in the slightest bit talking about the Pharisees, about bread. He's actually talking to them really importantly about the dangers of living in the world in which they are. He's saying, be very careful of the world in which you are. Yeast, you may be interested to know, is a very negative image in Hebrew thinking, and particularly in the New Testament. Yeast has that idea that it's a tiny thing and it grows exponentially and therefore brings bad things with it. It is absolutely fascinating, but for another day, that Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who buries yeast in a bowl, because actually if you were Hebrew you would go, no, it can't be. It can't be introducing yeast, because the kingdom of heaven you're therefore saying is like stuff that's like the Pharisees and the Herod. It's a negative category, so it's fascinating that it is introduced like that by Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. But what Jesus is trying to do is get them to see the bigger picture of what is going on. And of course, they've missed the bigger picture and are fixated on the bread moment. And this is the moment, back to your comment earlier about the tone of voice. It would be lovely at this point to know what tone of voice Jesus said, "Why are you still talking about having no bread?" It is the moment where I'm feeling just a little moment of irritation is coming into the voice. I may be wrong, but I can hear Jesus kind of gritting his teeth at this point and going, "You're still talking about the bread," and missing the point. The point being that Jesus has expected them now, at the end of this section of Mark's Gospel, to be able to do these things: to perceive and understand. So you'll notice the understand is still there from Mark 6, but the perceiving is very interesting. The word perceiving is about having insight. If you have insight, you can then comprehend. Hardening of hearts, picking up the theme that we noticed already in Mark 6. Have eyes and fail to see, ears and fail to hear. This is picking up the whole concept about perceiving and comprehension. The idea is, as we've established already, you see the things of God, you hear the things of God, you understand what's going on, and therefore the next time you understand why it is important. So you will notice that the final word becomes really very significant at this point. Do you not remember? The ability to recall the things of God is a vital characteristic of discipleship. To be able to tell what God has done so you're ready for it the next time. One of the things about which I am profoundly passionate is the reading of the Bible so that we are good at remembering the things of God. One of the questions I'm often asked is, why do we really need to read the Old Testament anymore? It's not relevant for us. Surely we'd be much better off. It's all a bit complicated and it's got people dying and it's all really not very nice. Wouldn't we be better just to skip the Old Testament and have just the nice stories in the Gospels? Much better. And the answer is no, we wouldn't. Because the point about the Old Testament is that the Old Testament helps you to see the things of God. It tells you the stories of the things of God. And the way in which you can perceive and understand and not have hard hearts is because you remember the things of God. You become expert rememberers of what God does and who God is. So, and let me just add one other thing into that, which for me is very important. When we today often describe God, we love abstract nouns. We love saying God is, and then adding an abstract noun. You know, God is love, God is compassion, God is those kind of things. The Old Testament never did, and neither did the New Testament writers. When they wanted to describe who God was, they told you what God did. So they would say, and you may recognize the phrases from the New Testament, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, the God who brought his people out of slavery in Egypt. And the reason why they tell those stories again and again and again is if you want to know who God is, you look at what God has done. If you want to remember who God is, you tell the stories of what God has done. And the reason why we must read the Old Testament is otherwise we will forget who God is, because we will forget the stories of what God has done. And therefore, remembering is a vital characteristic about discipleship. And I think it's very interesting just to observe that dynamic. But this is where you suddenly get a really fascinating sting in the tail. You might recognize elements of what Jesus says to the disciples there, because he said something like it already. And he said it in Mark 4. Which again, were you listening to Mark being read out, you would remember, because it would have been about 20 minutes ago. It wouldn't have been all that long time ago. And in Mark 4, in the middle of the parable of the sower, Jesus says, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables." This is Jesus talking to the disciples about parables. He's told them everything in secret, but there are the outsiders. And the outsiders are defined by those who look and do not perceive, those who listen but do not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. So Jesus is saying something here far, far greater than just you stupid people who aren't able to do this. What he's saying is, you who are disciples are defining yourself as outsiders because of your reaction to Jesus, because of your capacity to comprehend. And that is an absolutely chilling moment in Mark's Gospel, where you suddenly realize that the insiders are really the outsiders. And they're outsiders because of their response to Jesus, about how they've responded. Because people who are inside perceive and comprehend and see and hear and remember. And they're not doing any of that, so clearly they're defining themselves as outsiders. And in the master-disciple relationship, you'll realize that this is a very profound thing for Jesus to say. So what can we learn therefore about these characteristics that Jesus expected of his disciples? He expects that disciples are people who are not hard-hearted. They are people who can see and hear and understand. They are people who can see and hear and understand, and I missed a point out, which I intended to put on, they are people who can remember, people who can recall the things of God. Now, before I send you off to your conversation about this element of what's going on in Mark's Gospel, I'd just like to show you something else, which is back to where we started with. This is, if you remember these three, the stilling of the storm, the walking on the water, and the leaven of the Pharisees. And we noted that Jesus has conversations with the disciples at each one of these, and this was our kind of interest this morning. But you may remember that in the middle of these, Jesus had encounters with other people, with different people. And if you just look at that list, you will notice, with the exception of Jairus, who's a fascinating googly in the list, all the others are outsiders, either doubly or triply, for various different reasons. The Gerasene demoniac is a Gentile, and he is, according to Mark's account, mad. We would use different language these days. The woman with a hemorrhage is a woman, and she's bleeding. The Syrophoenician woman is a woman and she's a Gentile. The man who was deaf and had a speech impediment was deaf and had a speech impediment, and there was the man who was born blind. So they are all of them outsiders, clearly according to their society. They couldn't worship in the temple, either because they were ill, or because they were women, or because they were both, or because they were Gentiles. Name the reasons why these are outsiders. And what you discover in each one of these accounts is a deep and profound recognition of who Jesus is and response to Jesus. So at this remarkable point at Mark 8, you have the insiders who are suddenly declared to be the outsiders because of their response, and you have the outsiders who are declared to be the insiders because of their response. And Mark is there challenging us to think very carefully and very profoundly about who is in and who is out, and why they're in and why they're out. And it asks some really interesting and I think challenging questions of us about the nature of who we see to be disciples, who we see to be insider and outsider. And before I send you off for conversation, let me just tell you one other thing, which is a bit of a cheeky point, but nevertheless it's a point that I find very pleasing. There is a Greek word, which is the word paroikos. And the Greek word paroikos means an outsider. It's used in Luke 24 when the disciples say to Jesus, "Are you the only stranger who doesn't know what's going on? Somebody who doesn't belong." And it's there again in 1 Peter where it talks about people who are outsiders, aliens and exiles. The etymological origin of our word parochial is the Greek word paroikos. So we are communities of outsiders. And I'll leave you to chew on that, because I think that's absolutely fascinating, about what that means about our communities and who we are and how we self-define ourselves. But on to the task in hand, which is to reflect on this question of the final characteristics that Jesus expects of his disciples. People who are people whose hearts are not hard, people who can hear and see and understand. Again, we've got about 10 minutes for conversation, then 10 minutes for discussion, and we'll see where we get ourselves to at the end of this. So some thoughts for you on how we become people who are not hard-hearted, who can see and hear, perceive and understand. What does that mean? And you might just like to play with insiders and outsiders a bit, because I think that's quite interesting too.